The wagon wheels had stopped turning 3 days ago, but Adelaide Fletcher's screams still echoed through the cascade, mountains like a wounded animal calling for death to take her. She collapsed in grief beside the shallow grave she'd clawed. From the rocky soil with her bare hands, her wedding dress torn and stained with dirt and dried tears. Then through her sobs she heard a small voice that would change everything. "My papa can heal that," whispered the Modoc boy, emerging from the ancient pines like a forest spirit, sent to guide the broken back to the world of the living. What happened next in those sacred woods would prove that sometimes the deepest medicine comes not from civilization, but from those who still remember how to speak the language of wounded souls. The silence was the worst part. Not the empty wagon seats where her husband Thomas and 8-year-old daughter Lucy should have been sitting. Not even the fresh graves marked only by crude wooden crosses she'd hammered together from broken wagon boards. It was the absolute, crushing silence where their laughter used to live that was killing her faster than the mountain cold seeping through her torn wedding dress.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wind moved through the towering pines with a sound like distant weeping, as if the forest itself mourned what had been lost in this desolate clearing 3,000 feet above the civilized world. Adelaide Fletcher had been Mrs. Thomas Fletcher for exactly 6 days when the fever took them both. 6 days of marriage, 6 days of being Lucy's new mother, 6 days of believing she'd finally found her place in this wild frontier. After years of teaching school in lonely mining towns across California territory, the wedding had been simple. Held in the dusty church of Eureka with only the preacher's wife as witness, and Lucy beaming in her best blue dress, clutching a bouquet of wild lupins she'd picked herself that morning. Thomas had promised they'd build a real home in Oregon Territory, where Adelaide could teach Lucy to read poetry, and Lucy could teach Adelaide to catch fireflies and braid wildflowers into crowns that would make even the angels jealous. The memory of Lucy's gap-toothed grin as she declared, Adelaide the prettiest stepmother in all of California, struck like a physical blow. The child had been so excited about their journey north, chattering constantly about the chickens she'd raise and the garden she'd plant and the treehouse Thomas had promised to build her come spring. She'd made Adelaide promise to teach her to write her name in fancy script like the ladies back east, and Adelaide had sworn on her mother's grave that she'd teach Lucy to write not just her name but entire stories, poems that would capture the beauty of their new life in Oregon. But promises meant nothing to typhoid fever. The sickness had crept into their camp on the second night out of town, silent as smoke and twice as deadly. First, Lucy had complained of stomach pains while they were making camp beside a crystal clear mountain stream that now seemed like a mockery of life's beauty. Adelaide had attributed it to too much excitement and too many of the wild blackberries they'd found growing along the trail. But by midnight, the child was burning with fever, her small body shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. Thomas had developed the telltale rose-colored spots on his chest by dawn, and Adelaide knew with the terrible certainty of someone who'd seen this particular killer before that they were all doomed. She'd tried everything she knew from her years nursing sick miners in the camps around Grass Valley and Nevada City. Cold compresses made from torn petticoats soaked in the mountain stream, willow bark tea brewed over their dying campfire, desperate prayers whispered over fevered bodies that grew smaller and more fragile with each passing hour. She'd held Lucy's burning hand while the child called out for her real mama, the one who'd died birthing her 8 years ago, the one Adelaide could never replace no matter how much love she poured into this precious little soul. She'd pressed cool claws to Thomas's forehead while he mumbled apologies for bringing this curse upon them all, for dragging his new wife into this wilderness where death waited behind every tree and under every stone. The fever had raged for 4 endless days. 4 days of watching the two people she loved most in this world slip away bit by agonizing bit. 4 days of feeling completely helpless despite all her experience with frontier medicine, despite all her prayers, despite all her desperate bargaining. With a God who seemed to have turned his face away from this isolated mountain clearing. Thomas had been delirious most of the 3rd day, speaking to his first wife as if she stood beside their wagon, telling her how sorry he was for loving another woman, how he'd tried to be faithful to her memory, but loneliness had driven him to Adelaide's arms. The words had cut deeper than any knife, not because Adelaide doubted his love for her, but because she could hear the guilt eating him alive even as the fever consumed his body. Lucy had been worse in some ways because she'd remained lucid. Almost until the end. She'd asked Adelaide to sing her the lullaby about mockingbirds that her real mother used to hum, the one Thomas had taught his new wife just 3 weeks ago during their brief courtship. Adelaide had sung it through tears that felt like they might drown her, her voice cracking on every note, until Lucy's breathing simply stopped and the song died with her. The child's last words had been a whispered request for Adelaide to tell Mama I was good, tell her I didn't forget her even though I loved you too. Those words would haunt Adelaide for the rest of her days. However many or few that might be, Thomas had followed 12 hours later, slipping away during the pre-dawn darkness while Adelaide dozed fitfully against his shoulder, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion despite her determination to keep vigil. She'd awakened to find his hand cold in hers, his chest still and silent, his face peaceful for the first time in days. The guilt of not being awake for his final breath had nearly destroyed what little sanity she had left. She was supposed to be there. She was supposed to hold his hand and whisper words of love and comfort as he crossed from this world to whatever came next. Instead, he died alone while she slept, just as helpless in death as she'd been powerless to save him in life. Now Adelaide sat between their graves, her hands bloody from digging in the rocky soil with nothing but a tin plate and her own fingernails. The simple gold wedding ring Thomas had placed on her finger 6 days ago felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, heavy with the weight of promises broken by circumstances beyond any mortal control. She twisted it around and around, the metal warming against her skin with the only heat she'd felt since their deaths. Everything she'd owned was in that wagon. Her teaching certificates from the California State Normal School, her few precious books including the volume of Elizabeth Barrett Browning that had been her mother's, the daguerreotype of her parents. Back in Ohio, taken just before the cholera epidemic that had orphaned her at 17. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd lost 3 families in her 26 years of life, each one taken by disease, each one leaving her more broken than the last. First her parents to cholera when she was barely old enough to understand what death meant. Then the mining family she'd boarded with for 3 years until a cave-in took them all in a single, terrible night of screaming earth and crushing stone. She'd survived that catastrophe by pure chance, having been in town teaching late at the schoolhouse when the mountain decided to reclaim its gold. Coming home to find the cabin flattened and everyone she cared about buried under tons of rock had nearly broken her spirit completely. That's when she'd sworn off attachments, promised herself she'd never again risk the devastating pain of loving someone only to lose them. She'd spent 3 years moving from town to town, teaching in rough mining camps and frontier settlements, keeping her heart carefully locked away from anyone who might try to claim it. She'd been lonely but safe, isolated but unbroken, resigned to a life of professional service without personal connection. Then Thomas Fletcher had walked into her classroom in Eureka, hat in hand and shy smile on his weathered face, asking if she might consider tutoring his daughter in reading and arithmetic. He'd been recently widowed, struggling to raise Lucy alone while trying to establish his freight business between California and Oregon Territory. What had started as professional tutoring had slowly blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Genuine love. The kind that made Adelaide believe in second chances and happy endings. Despite all evidence to the contrary, their courtship had been brief but intense, both of them old enough to recognize something precious when they found it.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Thomas had been gentle and patient, understanding that Adelaide's heart carried old scars that needed tender handling. Lucy had been initially suspicious of any woman trying to fill her mother's place, but Adelaide's genuine affection and respect for the child's feelings had eventually won her over. The three of them had spent golden summer evenings on Thomas's front porch, Adelaide reading aloud from adventure novels while Lucy curled against her side, and Thomas whittled toys and trinkets with his steady, capable hands. The wedding had been everything Adelaide had dreamed of during her lonely years of spinsterhood. Simple, heartfelt, surrounded by the promise of building something beautiful together. Thomas had looked at her with such love during their brief ceremony, such certainty that they were meant to weather life's storms as partners. Lucy had insisted on throwing rose petals from the preacher's wife's garden, declaring that Adelaide needed proper princess treatment on her special day. They'd spent their wedding night in the town's only hotel, Lucy asleep in a small cot beside their bed, the three of them already feeling like a real family despite having known each other for less than 2 months. The journey north was supposed to be their honeymoon adventure, a chance to see the country between California and their new home, while Lucy experienced the excitement of real frontier travel. They'd packed carefully, planning for a 2-week journey that would take them through some of the most beautiful wilderness in the territory. Adelaide had brought her teaching supplies, intending to give Lucy lessons during their evening camps. Thomas had packed his survey instruments, planning to map potential freight routes for his business. Lucy had insisted on bringing her rag doll and her collection of pressed wildflowers, treasures she'd gathered during their brief courtship that now seemed like relics from another lifetime. Everything had been perfect for exactly 48 hours. 2 days of clear weather, stunning mountain vistas, and the kind of easy family conversation that made Adelaide believe she'd finally found her place in the world. Then the fever had struck, and paradise had become purgatory with the speed of a lightning strike. 6 days of marriage, 2 days of happiness, and now an eternity of guilt and grief stretching ahead like an endless winter. The mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere to the north lay Oregon Territory and the homestead Thomas had dreamed of building, the place where he'd planned to expand his freight business, and Adelaide had imagined teaching Lucy to become a strong, educated woman capable of thriving in this wild country. Somewhere to the south lay California and the life she'd tried to leave behind, the endless succession of temporary teaching positions and lonely, boarding house rooms that had defined her existence before Thomas and Lucy had given her a reason to hope for something better. But Adelaide couldn't imagine moving in either direction. She couldn't imagine moving at all. The grief had settled into her bones like winter cold, paralyzing and complete. Let the wolves take her. Let the mountain lions find her scent on the wind. Let the coming winter freeze her solid where she sat, another forgotten casualty of this unforgiving wilderness that gave life with one hand and snatched it away with the other. She'd heard stories of travelers found months later, preserved by the cold, their final expressions peaceful as if death had been a mercy rather than a tragedy. She pulled Thomas's hunting knife from its leather sheath with trembling fingers, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her palm. He'd taught her to use it during their brief courtship, insisting that any woman traveling the frontier needed to know how to defend herself and dress game. The blade caught the dying light, sharp and clean and final, honed to perfection by Thomas's careful attention, just 3 days before the fever had claimed him. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the crosses, to Lucy who would never grow up to teach school like her new stepmother, to Thomas who would never see his Oregon dream fulfilled, to the parents and family she'd lost before them. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry I can't live with failing you all. I'm sorry I'm too weak to carry this pain without breaking completely under its weight." The knife felt surprisingly light in her hand, surprisingly right. as if it had been waiting for this moment, this choice, this final act of surrender to the overwhelming darkness that had swallowed her whole. One quick cut and the pain would stop, one moment of courage, and she could follow them wherever souls went when bodies gave out, could beg their forgiveness in whatever realm awaited beyond this veil of tears. That's when she heard the footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving through the underbrush with the confidence of someone who belonged in these woods as naturally as the deer and elk that grazed in hidden meadows. Adelaide's head snapped up, expecting to see a mountain man or a wandering trapper, maybe even a Modoc warrior left over from the troubles that had plagued this region during the recent conflicts between the tribes and the U.S. Army. The Modoc war had officially ended just months ago, but everyone knew that individual warriors still moved through these mountains, some peaceful, others decidedly hostile to white settlers encroaching on traditional hunting grounds. Instead, a child stepped into the clearing, a boy perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with skin the color of burnished copper and hair black as a moonless night, braided with small leather ties adorned with carved bone beads that clicked softly as he moved. His clothes were a mixture of traditional native dress and white man's garments, soft deerskin leggings under a wool shirt that had seen better days, moccasins that made no sound on the forest floor despite the carpet of pine needles and fallen leaves, a small bow slung across his narrow back alongside a quiver decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of patient, loving hands creating something both beautiful and functional. He studied her with eyes that seemed far too old for his young face, taking in the knife in her hand, the fresh graves with their crude wooden markers, the wagon tilted at a broken angle where the wheel had snapped during their desperate attempt to find shelter when Thomas had become too weak to continue driving. Most children would have run from such a scene of obvious tragedy and potential danger. This boy stepped closer, his expression not fearful but deeply, profoundly sad. Not sad for himself, but sad for her, as if he recognized the particular weight of the grief she carried and understood its crushing power from personal experience. "Lady with the broken heart," he said in careful English, each word chosen deliberately, his accent musical and strange but perfectly comprehensible. "My papa says the forest told him you were coming." His voice was soft but clear, carrying the musical cadence of his native tongue beneath the English words like a river flowing over stones. "He says when people hurt this deep, they call to the spirits even when they don't mean to, even when they don't believe in spirits at all. The trees hear the calling. They carry the sound of broken hearts to those who know how to listen." They told him about the woman who dug graves with her hands and cries tears that taste like winter coming too early. Adelaide stared at him, the knife still trembling in her grip, her mind struggling to process this impossible encounter. "Your father sent you." Her voice came out as a croak, rough from 3 days of sobbing and dehydration, barely recognizable as the clear, confident tone she'd once used to command attention in frontier schoolrooms. Why would he care about a stranger's pain? The boy tilted his head, considering her question with the seriousness of a judge weighing evidence in a matter of life and death. "Papa says some hurt goes too deep for regular medicine. White man's medicine, even Indian medicine sometimes. The kind of medicine that works on cuts and broken bones and fever sickness." He pointed to her chest right over her heart with one small finger. "That kind of hurt, it needs special medicine. Medicine that works on the places where souls get broken, where the spirit tears like cloth and bleeds invisible blood. Papa knows about that kind of healing because he's needed that." "Kind of healing? Who is your father?" Adelaide asked, though part of her wondered if she was hallucinating, if grief and dehydration and 3 days without proper food had finally driven her completely mad. Maybe there was no boy at all, just her desperate mind conjuring hope where none existed, creating phantom salvation to distract her from the blade in her hand and the choice she'd been preparing to make. "His name is Esno. It means walks alone in our tongue, but he doesn't walk alone anymore. Not since he started." helping the broken people who find their way to our camp. The boy gestured toward the deep woods behind him, where the shadows were growing longer as afternoon faded toward evening, and the ancient pines seemed to whisper secrets in languages older than human memory. He was like you once. Lost everything that mattered. Wanted to follow the dead into the spirit world because staying in this world hurt too much to bear. But the ancestors wouldn't let him. They showed him a different path, a harder path, but one that leads to healing instead of just ending. Adelaide looked down at the knife, then at the graves, then at this impossible child who spoke of healing as if it were as real and natural as breathing, as if broken souls could be mended like torn fabric or reset like broken bones. "I've lost everything," she whispered, the words barely audible, over the evening wind stirring the pine boughs overhead. "My husband, my daughter, my reason for existing. My faith in a God who would let innocent children die while their parents watch helplessly. What could your father possibly do about that kind of devastation?" The boy moved closer, close enough that she could see the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the small medicine bag hanging from his belt made of soft leather and decorated with symbols she didn't recognize, but somehow found comforting. The way his dark eyes held flecks of gold like firelight reflected in deep water. "Papa doesn't fix broken things by making them like they were before. He says that's impossible, like trying to make a shattered pot hold water again by pressing the pieces back together. Once something breaks, it can't be unbroken. But it can be made into something new, something that knows how to carry the breaking without being destroyed by it. Something that's stronger because it's been broken and learned how to heal." He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she chose, and gently touched the blade of the knife with one small finger. Not trying to take it from her, just acknowledging its presence, its weight, its terrible potential. "This won't end the hurt," he said simply, his voice carrying a wisdom that seemed impossible in someone so young. "It will just pass the hurt to others who love you, and somewhere in the spirit world, the ones you lost will feel that hurt too. They'll know they couldn't keep you with them in this world, and they'll carry that sadness forever in whatever place souls go when bodies die." The words hit Adelaide like a physical blow, stealing what little breath she had left in her body. She hadn't thought about that, hadn't considered that Thomas and Lucy might somehow know if she followed them into death, might somehow understand that their loss had been so devastating it had driven her to abandon the gift of life they could no longer share. The knife suddenly felt unbearably heavy in her hand, weighted with implications she'd been too consumed by grief to consider. "My papa lost his wife and 3 children to white man sickness," Tupelo continued, his voice never losing its gentle cadence despite the weight of the words he carried. "Lost them the same way you lost yours. Fever that wouldn't break, medicine that wouldn't work, prayers that seemed to fall on deaf ears. He sat where you're sitting now, with the same kind of blade, making the same kind of choice." The boy paused, letting the weight of this revelation settle between them like dust after a landslide. But something stopped him, not someone, something, a vision maybe, a dream. A voice from the world beyond this one. It told him his breaking had a purpose, but only if he chose to live with it instead of die from it. Adelaide found herself leaning forward despite herself, drawn in by the boy's words, by the possibility that someone else had survived this particular kind of devastation and found a way to continue breathing when every breath felt like swallowing glass. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile moment of connection. This first spark of something other than despair she'd felt in 3 days. He chose to become a healer of broken souls. Not broken bodies, though he knows that medicine too. Broken spirits. People who've lost so much they can't remember how to want to be alive anymore. Tupelo gestured again toward the darkening forest, where the shadows between the massive pine Trunks seem to pulse with their own mysterious life. Our camp is sacred ground, hidden place where the boundary between this world and the spirit world grows thin as morning mist. People find their way there when they're ready to heal, or when they're ready to die. Papa helps them choose which one. The sun was setting now, painting the clearing in shades of amber and gold that seemed to make the boy glow like he was lit from within by some inner fire. Adelaide realized she'd been holding her breath, hanging on his every word like a drowning woman clinging to driftwood in a storm-tossed sea. "Why should I trust you?" she asked, though even as she spoke the words, she felt something inside her chest unclenching, some knot of despair loosening just enough to let her breathe without feeling like she was suffocating on her own grief. Tupelo smiled for the first time since appearing in her clearing, and the expression transformed his solemn young face into something radiant and warm, like sunrise breaking over snow-capped peaks. "Because, lady with the broken heart, you've been talking to me for 20 minutes, and you haven't used that knife yet. Part of you wants to heal, even if the rest of you doesn't know it yet." He stood up, brushing pine needles from his deerskin leggings with practiced ease. "Papa is waiting for you. He's been waiting for 3 days, ever since the trees told him about the woman who would need the deepest medicine. He's prepared the healing lodge and gathered the sacred plants. But the choice is yours. Come with me and learn to carry your breaking without being broken by it, or stay here and let the wolves have what's left of Adelaide Fletcher." Adelaide looked down at the knife one more time, feeling its weight in her palm like a cold judgment. Then at the graves that held everything she'd loved in this world. Then at this mysterious boy who spoke of healing like it was possible, like it was real, like it was waiting for her just beyond the edge of the forest. Slowly, deliberately, she drove the blade deep into the earth beside Thomas's grave and left it there. A marker of the choice she was making, a symbol of the path she was abandoning in favor of something unknown but potentially redemptive. "What's your name?" she asked, rising on unsteady legs that hadn't supported her weight properly in 3 days, her muscles cramped and aching from sitting motionless beside the graves. "Tupelo," the boy replied, offering her his small, warm hand with the solemnity of a diplomat extending an olive branch between warring nations. "It means swamp tree in the old language. Trees that grow in the wetlands where the water and earth meet, where two different worlds become one. Papa says I got that name because I help people cross from one world to another, like the places where land becomes water and water becomes land." Adelaide took his hand, surprised by the strength in his small fingers, by the immediate sense of steadiness that flowed from his touch into her trembling body like electricity through copper wire. His skin was warm and calloused from outdoor work, his grip confident and reassuring in a way that reminded her of Thomas's hands, though she pushed that comparison away before it could reopen wounds that had barely begun to scab over. "Lead the way, Tupelo," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in days, carrying notes of determination she'd thought were buried forever beneath the weight of her grief. "Show me what your father knows about healing broken souls." Tupelo began walking toward the forest's edge, his moccasined feet finding paths through the underbrush that were invisible to Adelaide's untrained eyes. She followed, stumbling occasionally over hidden roots and fallen branches, her civilization soft, boots awkward and noisy compared to the boy's silent passage through the wilderness. The deeper they moved into the forest, the more the world seemed to change around them, as if they were crossing invisible boundaries into territory, governed by different laws than those that ruled the clearings where white settlers built their farms and towns. The trees grew larger as they walked, their trunks so massive that Adelaide could have walked around them for minutes without completing a full circle. These were the ancient giants, the grandfathers and grandmothers of the forest, trees that had been seedlings when the first Spanish explorers had set foot on California soil centuries ago. Their branches intertwined high overhead, creating a living cathedral ceiling that filtered the dying sunlight into patterns of gold and green and deep, mysterious shadow. The air itself felt different here, thicker somehow, laden with the scent of pine resin and rich earth, and something else. Something indefinable that made the hair on Adelaide's arms stand up with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The trees are watching us, Tupelo said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than making a statement that would have sounded like madness coming from anyone else. They remember every person who's ever walked these paths. They know you're here now, and they're deciding whether you belong. He glanced back at her with those ancient eyes in his young face. Trees are good judges of character. They can tell the difference between people who want to heal and people who want to destroy. They can smell grief and anger and hope and despair. Right now they're trying to figure out which one you carry most. Adelaide looked up at the towering giants surrounding them, their bark grooved and scarred by centuries of storms and fires, and countless seasons of growth and dormancy. She'd never thought of trees as sentient beings before, but something about this place made such ideas seem not only possible but perfectly natural. The forest felt alive in a way that went far beyond the simple biological processes she'd learned about in her teacher's training. It felt aware, conscious, filled with an intelligence that predated human civilization by countless millennia. "What do you think they'll decide about me?" she asked, surprised to find that she genuinely cared about the answer, that the opinion of these silent giants somehow mattered more than the judgment of any human court. "They like you," Tupelo said with certainty that brooked no argument. "They can tell you're broken, but they can also tell you're not bitter. Bitterness poisons the soil, makes nothing grow. But grief, sadness, that's different. That feeds the earth, helps new things take root. The trees know the difference." He paused beside a particularly massive pine, its trunk scarred by old lightning strikes that had somehow failed to kill it. "This one knows about surviving being struck by fire from the sky. She says you have the same marks on your spirit, the same kind of scars that prove you're stronger than the things that tried to destroy you." Adelaide reached out tentatively and placed her palm against the deeply grooved bark, feeling the rough texture against her skin, the subtle vibration of life force moving through wood and sap and cambium. For just a moment, she could have sworn she felt something respond to her touch, some vast and patient consciousness acknowledging her presence with neither judgment nor pity, only acceptance of what she was and what she'd endured. The sensation lasted only seconds, but it left her feeling somehow lighter, as if the tree had taken a small portion of her burden and agreed to carry it in the deep silence of its heartwood. They continued walking as full darkness fell around them, but somehow Adelaide found she wasn't afraid. Tupelo moved with such confidence through the maze of tree trunks and fallen logs that she felt safe following his lead. Even when the path seemed to disappear entirely and they were walking through virgin forest that might not have seen human footsteps in decades. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, the haunting call of a great horned owl, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of wolves that made Adelaide's spine prickle with primitive fear, even as some deeper part of her recognized the sound as somehow right, somehow necessary to the wild harmony of this place. "Are we lost?" she asked after what felt like hours of walking, though she realized she had no real sense of time in this green darkness, where moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy overhead. "You can't get lost on the old paths," Tupelo replied, his voice carrying notes of gentle amusement. "The forest knows where you need to go, even when you don't. Papa says the trees laid down these trails thousands of years ago, long before the first humans learned to walk upright. They lead to places of power, places where the spirit world touches this world like fingers touching across a narrow stream. Our camp sits at the crossing of 3 such paths, which is why it's sacred ground, why the healing works there when it won't work anywhere else." As if summoned by his words, Adelaide began to see lights flickering through the trees ahead of them. Not the harsh yellow glare of oil lamps or the dancing orange of campfires, but something softer, more ethereal, like fireflies trapped in colored glass. The lights seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, sometimes bright enough to illuminate the massive tree trunks around them, sometimes fading to barely visible glimmers that might have been tricks of tired eyes and wishful thinking. "What are those lights?" Adelaide whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might cause them to disappear like startled deer. "Spirit lights," Tupelo said matter-of-factly. "They mark the boundaries of sacred ground, show the way for travelers who need healing. Papa says they're the souls of people who found peace here, people who learned to transform their pain into something beautiful before they crossed over to the other side. They stay to guide others who carry the same kind of wounds they once carried." The path began to widen as they approached the lights, and Adelaide could see that they were following what had once been a proper trail, worn smooth by countless feet over untold years. Strange symbols were carved into some of the larger trees, markings that looked like a mixture of pictographs and written language, telling stories in scripts she couldn't read, but somehow understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. The symbols seemed to speak of journeys undertaken and burdens shared, of pain acknowledged and healing found, of souls learning to sing again after they'd forgotten the melodies of joy. "How many people has your father helped?" Adelaide asked, as they walked between towering sentinels that seemed to lean inward over the path, like protective guardians. "Papa doesn't count numbers," Tupelo replied thoughtfully. "He says healing isn't about how many, it's about how deep. Some people need only a few days to remember who they were before the breaking. Others stay for months, learning slowly to trust life again. A few have stayed forever, becoming part of the healing circle, helping others the way Papa helped them. The forest has room for everyone who truly wants to heal." Ahead of them, the spirit lights grew brighter and more numerous, dancing through the air like luminous butterflies drawn to some invisible flower. Adelaide could hear water running. Somewhere nearby, the musical sound of a stream flowing over stones, and underneath that, something else. Human voices raised in harmony, singing in a language she didn't recognize but found hauntingly beautiful. The melody seemed to weave itself around the sound of flowing water and rustling leaves, creating a symphony that made her chest ache with emotions she couldn't name. "They're singing the sunset prayers," Tupelo explained as they crested a small rise and looked down into a hidden valley that took Adelaide's breath away. "Every evening, the circle gathers to thank the spirits for another day of healing, another day of learning to carry pain without being crushed by it. Papa says gratitude is the first medicine, the foundation all other healing builds on." The valley spread before them like something from a dream or a fairy tale. Ancient trees formed natural walls around a circular clearing perhaps 100 yards across, their branches reaching toward each other high overhead to create a living roof, pierced by openings that let in shafts of moonlight and starshine. The center of the clearing, a crystal-clear stream wound its way between moss-covered rocks, fed by a small waterfall that cascaded down from the valley's far wall. The sound of falling water provided a constant, soothing backdrop to the evening's activities. Scattered throughout the clearing were structures that seemed to grow from the earth itself, lean-tos and small cabins built from living trees whose branches had been encouraged to grow in specific patterns, their walls formed by interwoven saplings and their roofs made of bark and living moss. Smoke rose from several fire pits where people sat in small groups, some talking quietly, others working on crafts or preparing food, all of them moving with the unhurried peace of souls who had found their place in the world. At the valley's heart stood a larger structure that Adelaide immediately recognized as special, sacred in a way that made her want to remove her shoes and lower her voice to a whisper. It was built like the others from living wood, but its design was more complex. Its walls carved with the same mysterious symbols she'd seen on the trail trees. Soft light emanated from its windows, not the harsh glare of oil lamps but something warmer, more natural, as if the building itself generated illumination from some internal source. The Healing Lodge, Tupelo said softly, following her gaze. That's where Papa works with people who carry the deepest wounds, the ones that cut all the way through to the soul. He's waiting for you there. As they descended into the valley, Adelaide became aware that the other inhabitants of this strange community were watching their approach with interest but no apparent surprise, as if they'd been expecting her arrival. She saw faces of all ages and backgrounds, weathered mountain men and delicate-featured women, children who played quietly around the fire pits and elders who sat smoking pipes and staring into the dancing flames with expressions of hard-won peace. Some were clearly Native American, their clothing and ornaments marking them as members of various tribes. Others were obviously white settlers, though their clothes had taken on the practical, earth-toned characteristics of people who lived close to the land. Who are all these people? Adelaide asked as they walked past a group of women working on what looked like a communal quilt, their fingers moving in perfect synchronization as they stitched patterns that seemed to shift and change in the firelight. Broken people who learned to heal, Tupelo said simply. People who lost everything and found something new. People who discovered that the end of one story can be the beginning of another, if you're brave enough to turn the page. He gestured toward an elderly white man who sat beside one of the fires, teaching a young Indian boy how to carve intricate designs into a piece of driftwood. That's Samuel. He lost his whole family to a Pute raid 5 years ago, came here wanting to die, learned to live instead. Now he teaches others how to make beautiful things from broken pieces. They passed another fire where a middle-aged Indian woman was grinding herbs in a stone mortar while several younger women watched and asked questions. That's Ajana, Tupelo continued. She lost her husband and sons in the Modoc War, spent 2 years wandering the mountains like a ghost. Papa found her trying to walk into a blizzard with no clothes or food. Now she's the camp's medicine keeper, one of the wisest healers in all the territory. With each person Tupelo pointed out, Adelaide began to understand the true nature of this place. It wasn't just a camp or even a community in the usual sense. It was a sanctuary for the broken-hearted, a haven for souls who had lost everything that mattered and needed to learn new ways of being human. The racial and cultural differences that caused so much conflict in the outside world seemed irrelevant here, rendered meaningless by the universal language of suffering and the shared journey toward healing. How do they all get along? Adelaide asked, watching a group that included white settlers, Indian children, and what looked like a former cavalry soldier, all working together to repair a damaged shelter. In the outside world, these people would be enemies. Pain erases differences, Tupelo replied with wisdom that seemed impossible in someone so young. When you've lost everything that defined who you thought you were, skin color and language and tribal loyalty stop mattering. What matters is finding others who understand the particular weight of emptiness, who know what it feels like to wake up each morning wishing you hadn't. Here, everyone speaks the same language, the language of hearts learning to beat again. As they approached the healing lodge, Adelaide felt her nervousness returning. Through the translucent walls of the structure, she could see a figure moving, slowly and deliberately, arranging objects with the careful precision of someone preparing for a sacred ritual. The singing had stopped, and the valley had settled into the peaceful quiet of evening, broken only by the sound of flowing water and the occasional murmur of conversation around the distant fires. Is he expecting me? Adelaide asked, suddenly, conscious of her bedraggled appearance, her torn wedding dress and unwashed hair, and the lingering scent of grief that seemed to cling to her like smoke. Papa doesn't expect people, Tupelo said, reaching for the leather flap that served as the lodge's door. He simply prepares for them, trusting that the ones who need healing will find their way here when they're ready. He's been preparing for you since the moment the trees whispered your pain into his dreams 3 nights ago. Before Adelaide could ask what that meant, Tupelo pushed aside the door flap and gestured for her to enter. Taking a deep breath, that felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown waters. Adelaide Fletcher crossed the threshold of the healing lodge and came face to face with the man who would teach her that broken souls, like broken bones, could heal stronger than they'd been before. The interior of the healing lodge defied everything Adelaide thought she knew about frontier architecture. The walls curved upward in a perfect dome, their surface smooth as polished stone despite being formed entirely from living wood. Intricate carvings spiraled from floor to ceiling, telling stories in symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the soft light emanating from crystals embedded in the wooden walls. The air itself hummed with energy, thick with the scent of burning sage and cedar and something else, something that made her skin tingle and her heart race with a mixture of fear and anticipation she couldn't explain. At the lodge's center sat a man who could only be Esno, though he looked nothing like Adelaide had expected. She'd imagined someone ancient and mystical, draped in traditional regalia and radiating otherworldly power. Instead, she found herself facing a man perhaps 40 years old, dressed in simple buckskin pants and a white cotton shirt that had seen better days. His hair hung loose around his shoulders, black shot through with premature silver that caught the crystal light like moonbeams on dark water. Scars crisscrossed his forearms in patterns that spoke of deliberate cutting, ritual markings that had healed into raised welts-forming symbols she couldn't read, but somehow understood spoke of sacrifice and transformation. What struck her most powerfully were his eyes. They were the darkest brown she'd ever seen, almost black, but filled with a depth that seemed to contain entire universes of understanding. When he looked at her, Adelaide felt as if he could see straight through to her soul, past all the walls and defenses she'd built over 26 years of protecting herself from life's cruelties. It should have been terrifying, that level of scrutiny, but instead she found it oddly comforting, like finally being truly seen after years of existing as a shadow of her real self. "Adelaide Fletcher," he said, his voice carrying the same musical cadence as his son's but deeper, resonant with authority and compassion in equal measure. "The woman who teaches children to read the stories of others, but has forgotten how to read the story of her own heart." He gestured to a pile of soft furs arranged in a circle around a small fire pit where flames danced without producing smoke. "Sit, we have much work to do, and the night spirits are already gathering to witness your transformation." Adelaide lowered herself onto the furs, surprised by their incredible softness and warmth. The fire cast no smoke because it burned with wood that had been specially prepared, each log carved with symbols and treated with oils that allowed complete combustion. As she settled into position, she became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed before: the whisper of wind through the lodge's walls, the distant call of night birds, and underneath it all, a rhythmic drumming that seemed to come from the earth itself, as if the planet's heartbeat had become audible in this sacred space. "Tupelo told me you lost your family to fever," Esno said, moving around the circle with fluid grace, gathering items from shelves carved directly into the living walls. "But that's only part of your story, isn't it? The fever was simply the final blow, the last in a series of losses that began long before you ever met Thomas Fletcher." He placed a carved wooden bowl beside the fire and began adding ingredients: dried herbs, crushed minerals that sparkled like stars, a few drops of liquid from a vial that seemed to contain captured moonlight. Adelaide watched his preparations with growing unease. "How could you possibly know about my past? Tupelo said you've been expecting me, but we've never met, and I've told no one in California about my life before coming west." Her voice carried a note of challenge, though whether she was challenging his knowledge or her own willingness to believe in such things, she couldn't say. Esno smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something unexpectedly gentle. "The spirits speak of all things to those who know how to listen. They whispered to me of a girl who watched her parents die of cholera when she was barely old enough to understand death's finality. They told me of a young woman who survived a mine collapse that killed everyone she'd come to love, who made herself hard and distant to avoid ever feeling such pain again. They spoke of a teacher who kept her heart locked away like a precious treasure, too fragile to risk in the world of the living. The accuracy of his words hit Adelaide like physical blows, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire's warmth. If you know so much about my past, then you know I'm cursed. Everyone I love dies. Every family I join falls apart. Maybe it would be better if I just, better if. You what? Esno interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through her spiral of self-pity. Better if you prove the dark spirits right by destroying yourself? Better if you let fear and guilt make all your choices for you. He knelt beside his preparations, grinding herbs with a stone pestle that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The spirits also told me of a woman who has saved more lives than she's lost, who has taught dozens of children to read and write and think for themselves, who has brought light into dark places simply by refusing to let her own darkness consume her completely. Adelaide stared at him, tears beginning to form in her eyes despite her attempts to maintain composure. You don't understand. I couldn't save them. I watched Thomas and Lucy die, and I couldn't do anything to help them. I failed them just like I failed everyone else I've ever cared about. Maybe I'm not meant to love anyone. Maybe I'm meant to be alone. Alone, Esno repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. Do you know what alone really means? I spent 3 years after my family's death believing I was alone, convinced that the spirits had abandoned me to suffer without purpose or hope. I wandered these mountains like a madman, talking to ghosts, fighting shadows, begging the earth to open up and swallow me whole. He added water to his bowl, and the mixture began to emit a soft phosphorescent glow. But alone is an illusion, Adelaide Fletcher. Alone is what happens when we forget that every soul who has ever loved us remains connected to us across the boundaries between life and death. He lifted the glowing bowl with both hands and offered it to her. This is vision medicine made from plants that grow only in places where the spirit world touches our world. It will show you truths your waking mind isn't ready to accept, help you see connections your grief has blinded you to, but you must choose to drink it. I cannot force healing on anyone who isn't ready to be healed. Adelaide looked at the softly glowing liquid, its surface rippling with colors that had no names in any human language. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about drinking mysterious potions offered by medicine men in magical lodges. But a deeper part of her, the part that had felt the tree's consciousness and seen the spirit lights dancing through the forest, recognized this moment as a turning point. She could refuse the medicine and return to her graves and her knife and her carefully planned surrender to despair, or she could trust this strange man and his impossible claims about healing broken souls. What will I see? She asked, her hands trembling as she reached for the bowl. What you need to see, Esno replied. Every person's vision is different, shaped by their wounds and their willingness to heal. Some see their lost loved ones, speaking words of forgiveness and guidance. Others see their own life story from a different perspective, understanding for the first time how their pain has prepared them for purposes they never imagined. A few see the future, glimpses of who they might become if they choose healing over surrender. He settled back onto his own pile of furs, his dark eyes reflecting. The fires dance. The medicine doesn't lie, but it doesn't always tell comfortable truths. Adelaide lifted the bowl to her lips, paused for one last moment of hesitation, then drank the entire contents in 3 quick swallows. The liquid tasted like starlight and rain and the deep silence of ancient forests, coating her throat with warmth that spread slowly through her chest and down into her limbs. For several minutes, nothing happened. She sat waiting, wondering if she'd been fooled by clever theater and phosphorescent tricks, when suddenly the lodge's walls began to pulse with their own rhythm, breathing like a living thing. The carved symbols started moving, flowing like liquid across the wooden surfaces, rearranging themselves into new patterns that told stories she could read without having learned the language. She watched her own life unfold in wooden hieroglyphs, her childhood in Ohio, her parents' death, her years of wandering from town to town teaching other people's children, while her own heart remained empty and afraid. But the symbols showed her something else too, something she'd never seen before, the threads of connection that linked her to every life she'd touched, every student she'd taught, every family she'd briefly joined. Do you see them? Esno's voice seemed to come from very far away, though when she turned to look at him, he sat exactly where he'd been before. Do you see the web of light that connects every soul you've ever loved to your own soul? Death doesn't break those connections, Adelaide. Death just changes them, makes them invisible to eyes that only know how to see the physical world. The vision deepened, and suddenly Adelaide could see them all, her parents, standing behind her with their hands on her shoulders, their faces radiant with pride and love. The mining family she'd lost to the cave-in gathered around her like protective guardians, their ghostly forms solid and real as her own body. And there, stepping forward from the crowd of spirits, came Thomas and Lucy, their faces free of fever's ravages, their eyes bright with joy and understanding. Adelaide. Thomas's voice carried all the warmth she remembered from their brief marriage, but now it also carried wisdom that transcended earthly understanding. Beautiful Adelaide, why do you carry guilt for things that were never your fault? Fever is fever, death is death. The wheel of existence turns regardless of how much love we pour into trying to stop it. Your love didn't fail us. Your love gave us 6 days of perfect happiness after years of loneliness and sorrow. Lucy stepped forward, no longer the fevered, delirious child Adelaide had held in her final moments, but vibrant and glowing with spiritual energy that made her seem older and wiser than her 8 earthly years. Mama Adelaide, she said, using the name she'd only spoken once in life, during her final fever dreams, you taught me to read in just 2 weeks. You taught me that stories have power, that words can create whole worlds. Now I'm in a world made entirely of stories, and I remember everything you taught me. Every night, I read to the other children here, and I tell them about the best stepmother who ever lived. Adelaide reached out to touch them, to hold them one more time, but her hands passed through their forms like smoke. The pain of that failed connection nearly shattered her concentration. But Thomas spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. We're not here to be held, my love. We're here to set you free. Free from the guilt that's been poisoning your ability to love. Free from the fear that's been keeping you from the life you're meant to live. What life? Adelaide sobbed, her words echoing strangely in the vision space. What's left for me now? I don't know how to exist without you both. You don't exist without us, Lucy said, her child's voice carrying notes of ancient wisdom. We're part of you now, part of your story, part of everything you'll do from this moment forward. Every child you teach, every person you help, every moment of joy you allow yourself to feel, will be there sharing it with you. But only if you choose to live, only if you choose to love again, despite knowing it might hurt. The vision began to shift, showing Adelaide glimpses of possible futures, herself teaching in a one-room schoolhouse filled with children of all races and backgrounds, their faces bright with curiosity and hope. Herself working alongside other healers in Esno's sanctuary, helping broken souls learn to trust life again. Herself older, grayer, surrounded by students who had become teachers themselves, carrying forward the lessons she'd taught them about the power of knowledge and compassion. Your greatest purpose lies ahead of you, not behind you, Thomas said, his form beginning to fade as the vision reached its climax. You were meant to touch many lives, to plant seeds of wisdom and kindness that will grow long after your body returns to earth. But that can only happen if you choose to continue the story instead of ending it prematurely. We love you, Lucy called out as she too began to fade. We love you enough to let you go, to encourage you to find new love, new family, new reasons to celebrate the gift of existence. Promise us you'll try, Mama Adelaide. Promise us you'll remember that living well is the best way to honor those who can no longer live. Adelaide tried to call out to them, to make the promises they asked for, but the vision was dissolving around her like morning mist touched by sunlight. The lodge's walls solidified back into carved wood. The fire returned to normal flames, and she found herself staring into Esno's patient, knowing eyes. Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of pure despair. Mixed with the grief was something else, something that felt almost like gratitude. What did you see? Esno asked gently, though his expression suggested he already knew. Them, Adelaide whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. All of them. My parents, the mining family, Thomas and Lucy. They were so real, so present. They spoke to me, told me things I needed to hear. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, surprised to find that the simple gesture didn't feel futile anymore. They want me to live. They want me to find new purposes, new people to love. They said my greatest work still lies ahead. Esno nodded, unsurprised by her revelation. The dead don't want us to join them before our time. They want us to honor their memory by living fully, by loving completely, by using the wisdom our pain has taught us to help others who struggle with similar burdens. He stood and moved to another section of the lodge, returning with a small leather pouch that he placed in her hands. This contains seeds from the vision plant, along with other medicines that will help you when the grief threatens to overwhelm you again, and it will threaten Adelaide. Healing isn't a destination, it's a daily choice, a continuous process of choosing life over death, hope over despair. Adelaide clutched the pouch, feeling its weight like an anchor to this new reality. What happens now? Do I stay here? Do I go back to the outside world? I don't know how to begin again. How to build a life that honors what I've learned here tonight. That choice is yours to make, Esno said, settling back onto his furs. Some people stay in the sanctuary for months or even years, learning the deeper mysteries of healing before returning to share their knowledge with the world. Others leave quickly, carrying their transformation like seeds to be planted in distant soil. There's no right or wrong path, only the path that calls to your spirit most strongly. As if summoned by their conversation, the lodge's entrance flap stirred, and Tupelo appeared, his young face grave with concern. Papa, he said urgently, riders are coming. Many riders, moving fast, carrying torches. Samuel says they look like cavalry soldiers, and they're asking about the woman who disappeared from the wagon train massacre site. Adelaide's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Massacre? What massacre? There was no massacre, just fever. Just my family dying of natural causes. But even as she spoke the words, she realized how her situation might look to outside observers. An abandoned wagon, fresh graves, a missing woman, all in territory where tensions between white settlers and native tribes remained dangerously high. Esno's expression darkened, and for the first time since she'd entered the lodge, Adelaide saw something other than calm wisdom in his eyes. The outside world has little patience for nuance, especially when it involves white women and Indian camps. They'll assume you were taken against your will, assume this sanctuary is a hostile stronghold rather than a place of healing. He stood quickly, moving with sudden urgency. You must choose now, Adelaide Fletcher. Stay and risk being rescued by men who will destroy everything they don't understand, or trust in the healing you've begun and help us protect this sacred place from those who would see it burn to ash. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by voices calling her name through the forest darkness. Adelaide looked at the medicine pouch in her hands, thought of the visions she'd seen, the promises she'd made to the spirits of her loved ones. This was her first test, the first moment when she would choose between the old Adelaide who let fear make her decisions and the new Adelaide who might yet become someone worthy of the love she'd been given. "I choose to stay," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "I choose to protect this place and learn what you have to teach me. But how do we convince armed soldiers that I'm here by choice, that this sanctuary isn't what they think it is?" Esno smiled, and in that expression, Adelaide saw both profound approval and the beginning of a plan that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of healing broken souls. The thunderous approach of cavalry horses shattered the sanctuary's peaceful evening like cannon fire through crystal. Adelaide felt the earth vibrating beneath her feet as she followed Esno and Tupelo from the healing lodge, the sacred silence of the valley replaced by the harsh sounds of military commands and jangling equipment. Through the trees, she could see the dancing orange glow of torches, their light aggressive and alien against the soft spirit lights that had welcomed her just hours before. 20 riders, maybe more, Samuel called out from his position near the valley's eastern entrance, his weathered face grim with the knowledge of someone who'd seen too many peaceful places destroyed by men with guns and certainty. They're spread out in search formation, moving systematic-like. This ain't no rescue party stumbling around in the dark. These boys know exactly what they're doing. Esno moved through the gathering crowd of sanctuary dwellers with calm authority, his presence steadying nerves that threatened to fray under the pressure of approaching confrontation. "Everyone, to your designated positions," he said quietly, his voice carrying easily across the clearing without seeming to strain. "Remember, we are a peaceful community of mixed peoples learning to live in harmony. Nothing more, nothing less. Let them see cooperation, not defiance. Show them healing, not hostility." Adelaide watched in amazement as the entire community transformed before her eyes. The scattered groups around individual fires coalesced into a single gathering near the central stream. White settlers and Native Americans sitting together in perfect integration, their children playing quietly between the adults while evening. Chores continued without apparent concern for the approaching soldiers. It looked exactly like what it was, a harmonious community where racial differences had been transcended by shared purpose and mutual respect. "This has happened before," Tupelo explained, appearing at her elbow with the quiet grace she was learning to expect from him. "Not often, but sometimes the outside world comes looking for people they think have been taken or killed. Papa always says the best defense against suspicion is transparent truth. Let them see everything, answer every question honestly, and eventually they realize there's nothing here that threatens them." The sound of approaching voices grew clearer as the cavalry patrol reached the valley's edge. Adelaide could make out individual words now, harsh commands barked in the clipped tones of military authority. "Spread out and secure the perimeter. Watch for hostile movement in the tree line. Remember, we're looking for a missing white woman, probably being held against her will. Stay alert and keep your weapons ready, Mrs. Fletcher." The voice that called her name carried across the clearing like a whip crack, full of assumed authority and barely controlled aggression. "Mrs. Adelaide Fletcher, if you can hear me, call out. We're United States Cavalry, here to rescue you from your captors." Adelaide felt every eye in the sanctuary turn toward her, waiting for her response, her choice. This was the moment Esno had warned her about, the first real test of her commitment to the healing path she'd begun. She could call out, allow herself to be rescued by men who would never understand what she'd experienced here, who would see only a white woman among Indians and assume the worst. Or she could trust in the transformation she'd undergone, stand with the people who had shown her a different way of being human. "I'm here," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the water and up the valley slopes. "I'm safe and I'm here by choice. There's been no kidnapping, no violence, no crime of any kind." The words felt strange on her tongue, foreign yet true, like speaking a new language she was just learning to use. A commotion erupted from the forest as the cavalry patrol crashed through the underbrush, their passage marked by snapping branches and muttered curses, as horses navigated terrain better, suited to moccasins than military boots. Within minutes, armed soldiers emerged into the clearing, their rifles raised and ready, eyes scanning for threats that existed only in their imaginations, fed by years of frontier prejudice and military training. The patrol's leader rode directly toward Adelaide, his uniform marking him as a lieutenant despite his youth. He couldn't have been more than 25, his face clean-shaven and earnest in the way of men who'd learned warfare from textbooks rather than experience. When he saw her sitting peacefully among the mixed community, his expression shifted. Through confusion, relief, and something that might have been disappointment. "Mrs. Fletcher?" he asked, dismounting with the stiff precision of academy training. "Lieutenant William Carruthers, 3rd California Cavalry. We received reports of a wagon train attack, evidence of violence, missing persons. When we found your abandoned wagon and the fresh graves, we assumed the worst had occurred." His eyes swept over the peaceful scene before him, clearly struggling to reconcile what he saw with what he'd expected to find. "There was no attack, Lieutenant," Adelaide replied, rising to her feet with dignity she hadn't possessed 3 days ago. "My husband and stepdaughter died of typhoid fever while we were traveling north. I buried them myself and was found in my grief by these good people, who offered me shelter and comfort in my time of need." She gestured toward Esno, who stood watching the exchange with patient attention. "This is a healing sanctuary, a place where people of all backgrounds come to recover from loss and trauma. I am here as a guest, not a captive." Lieutenant Carruthers studied her carefully, his military training warring with the evidence of his own eyes. Adelaide looked healthy, well-fed, clearly unstressed despite her recent losses. Her clothes, while travel-worn, showed no signs of forced captivity or abuse. Most tellingly, she spoke with the calm authority of someone making free choices, rather than the desperate undertones of someone crying for help. "With respect, ma'am," Carruthers said, his tone growing more formal as he tried to maintain authority. "In a situation that didn't fit his preconceptions, you've been through severe trauma. Sometimes people in shock don't realize when they're being manipulated or coerced. These people, regardless of their intentions, are harboring a white woman in territory where tensions remain high. For your safety and theirs, I'm going to have to insist you come with us back to the nearest settlement." A murmur of unease rippled through the sanctuary community, though no one moved aggressively or reached for weapons. They had lived through enough confrontations to know that any sudden movement could be interpreted as hostile intent by nervous soldiers. Instead, they simply watched and waited, trusting in Esno's wisdom and Adelaide's newfound strength to navigate this crisis without bloodshed. "Lieutenant," Esno spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, despite holding no official rank. "I am Esno, keeper of this sanctuary. Perhaps you would accept an invitation to share our evening meal, to see for yourself the nature of this community before making decisions that might cause unnecessary hardship for everyone involved." He gestured toward the central fire where food was already being prepared. "Your men are welcome as well. We have nothing to hide and much to share." Carruthers hesitated, his tactical training telling him to maintain distance from potential enemies, while his eyes showed him a scene of domestic tranquility that challenged every assumption he'd brought to this encounter. Around the clearing, his soldiers waited for orders, their weapons still ready but their postures gradually relaxing as they observed children playing, women cooking, men working on crafts and repairs, with the unhurried pace of people living normal, peaceful lives. "This is highly irregular," the lieutenant said finally, though Adelaide could hear his resolve weakening. "My orders were to locate Mrs. Fletcher and ensure her safety. I wasn't briefed on the possibility of finding a multicultural community operating outside normal territorial authority." "Then perhaps," Adelaide interjected, her voice gaining strength as she found her footing in this new reality, You should take time to gather complete information before acting on incomplete. Intelligence. I am a grown woman, Lieutenant, fully capable of making my own choices about where I live and with whom I associate. I've been here less than a day, but I've already seen more genuine healing and human cooperation than I witnessed in years of traveling through supposedly civilized settlements. Her words carried across the clearing with crystalline clarity, and Adelaide realized that every person in the sanctuary was listening, waiting to see how this test of their community's values would resolve. She thought of the vision medicine ceremony, of Thomas and Lucy urging her to live fully and love completely, of the promise she'd made to honor their memory by choosing courage over fear. I'll stay for one meal, Carruthers decided, his military bearing softening slightly as curiosity overcame protocol. But I want to interview Mrs. Fletcher privately, and I need assurances that my men and I can leave peacefully whenever we choose to do so. Of course, Esno replied with a slight smile that suggested he'd expected exactly this response. Violence serves no one's interests here. We are all Americans, all human beings seeking to live in peace and dignity despite the conflicts that divide our larger communities. Perhaps spending an evening together will remind us of what we share rather than what separates us. What followed was unlike anything Lieutenant Carruthers or his men had experienced in their military service. The sanctuary community welcomed the soldiers as honored guests, sharing food prepared with skill and care, offering stories of their individual journeys to this peaceful valley, demonstrating through lived example that cooperation between races and cultures was not only possible but beneficial for everyone involved. Adelaide found herself seated between Esno and the young lieutenant, serving as a bridge between two worlds that rarely spoke to each other with anything approaching mutual respect. She told Carruthers about her teaching career, her losses, her discovery that healing came not from isolation, but from connection with others, who understood the weight of grief and the possibility of transformation. This is not what I expected to find, Carruthers admitted as the evening wore on, his formal military posture gradually relaxing into something more human. My briefings described this region as hostile territory inhabited by renegade Indians who couldn't be trusted around white civilians. Instead, I find a community that seems to have solved problems our best territorial administrators can't even address. Fear makes monsters of us all, Ayana observed from her position across the fire, her weathered face reflecting decades of wisdom earned through suffering and healing. When we expect enemies, we find enemies. When we look for common ground, we discover that human hearts beat with the same rhythms, regardless of the color of skin that covers them. As the night deepened and the soldiers gradually shed their suspicions, Adelaide realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, the kind of genuine cultural exchange that might be possible if fear and prejudice didn't poison every interaction between different peoples. The cavalry troopers shared stories of their own losses and struggles, finding unexpected common ground with Native Americans they'd been trained to see as threats rather than fellow human beings. When Lieutenant Carruthers finally requested his private interview with Adelaide, she met his questions with honesty that left no doubt about her mental clarity or freedom of choice. I came here broken and ready to die, she told him simply. These people showed me how to live again, how to transform grief into purpose rather than letting it destroy me. I'm staying because I choose to stay, because I've found something here worth protecting and nurturing. The lieutenant studied her for a long moment, his young face serious with the weight of making decisions that would affect many lives. I could order you to come with us anyway, he said finally. My superiors expect me to bring back evidence of successful resolution to this situation. You could, Adelaide agreed. But that would make you no different from the men who destroyed this same community 20 years ago, who burned the original healing lodge because they couldn't understand what they were seeing. She met his eyes directly, letting him see the strength she'd found in the past day. Or you could be the kind of officer who recognizes that some things are too valuable to destroy, even when they don't fit neatly into military regulations. Lieutenant Carruthers was quiet for nearly a minute, weighing the options that would define not only this moment, but his own character as a leader and a human being. Finally, he stood and extended his hand to Adelaide with the respect due an equal, rather than the condescension typically shown to women in distress. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said formally, "I will report that you were found safe and in good health, living voluntarily among peaceful civilians in a multicultural community that poses no threat to territorial security. I trust you will send word if your circumstances change and you require assistance." Adelaide shook his hand, feeling the weight of victory tempered by the knowledge that not all such encounters would end so peacefully. "Thank you, Lieutenant. Your willingness to see beyond your expectations may have saved more lives than you realize." As the cavalry patrol prepared to leave, several soldiers approached sanctuary residents with quiet requests for information about treating various ailments and injuries, professional curiosity overcoming cultural barriers. Lieutenant Carruthers himself spent several minutes in deep conversation with Esno, discussing the practical challenges of maintaining peace in a region where fear and misunderstanding bred violence with depressing regularity. When the soldiers finally rode away into the forest darkness, their departure marked not by threats or ultimatums, but by expressions of mutual respect and understanding. Adelaide felt something shift permanently in her perception of what was possible in this divided world. She had faced her first test as a member of the sanctuary community and discovered that truth, spoken with courage and backed by authentic action, could indeed triumph over prejudice and fear. "Well done," Esno said simply as they watched the last torch disappear between the trees. "You chose to trust rather than retreat, to build bridges rather than walls. That is the essence of true healing, the foundation upon which all other medicine builds." Adelaide nodded, feeling the weight of her transformation settling into her bones like strength rather than burden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose healing over harm, connection over isolation. But tonight, she had proven to herself and others that broken souls could indeed become stronger at the mended places. That grief transformed could become a force for bringing light into dark corners of the world. 3 weeks had passed since Lieutenant Carruthers and his cavalry patrol had ridden away into the night, but Adelaide's real education was just beginning. The morning sun filtered through the ancient pines as she knelt beside a young woman who had arrived at the sanctuary just 2 days earlier, her face bearing the haunted expression Adelaide recognized all too well. Maria Santos had lost her entire family to a cholera outbreak that swept through her mining town, leaving her the sole survivor of a household that had once buzzed with the laughter of 6 children and the steady presence of a husband who'd worked the silver mines for 15 years. "The guilt is the worst part," Maria whispered in heavily accented English, her calloused hands trembling as she tried to hold the cup of healing tea Adelaide had prepared for her. "I should have died with them. What kind of mother survives when all her babies perish? What kind of wife continues breathing when her husband's body grows cold in the ground?" Her dark eyes held the same emptiness Adelaide had carried to Thomas and Lucy's graves, the terrible void left behind when love has nowhere to go. Adelaide felt something profound shift inside her chest as she listened to Maria's words. For the first time since arriving at the sanctuary, she wasn't the one receiving comfort, but offering it, drawing on the hard-won wisdom of her own journey through the valley of shadows to light a candle for someone else lost in that same darkness. "The guilt isn't real," she said softly, placing her hand over Maria's trembling fingers. "It feels real. It weighs like stone in your chest, but it's not truth. It's just grief wearing the mask of responsibility, trying to give meaning to losses that have no meaning beyond the simple fact that we live in a world where beautiful things sometimes end too soon." The transformation happening within Adelaide was visible to everyone in the sanctuary community. Esno watched from his position near the healing lodge as she worked with Maria, noting how naturally she'd taken to the role of wounded healer. Someone whose own scars had become sources of strength rather than weakness. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, Adelaide had helped comfort 2 other newcomers, an elderly white trapper whose partner of 30 years had been killed by a rockslide, and a Modoc teenager whose entire family had been wiped out by the same influenza epidemic that had claimed 3 other families in the region. "She's found her calling," Tupelo observed, appearing at his father's elbow with the quiet grace that seemed to run in their family bloodline. Teaching was what she did before, but healing broken hearts is what she was meant to do. "You can see it in how she moves around people who hurt the way she used to hurt." Esno nodded, though his expression remained thoughtful rather than celebratory. True healing work requires more than natural compassion and personal experience. It demands understanding of forces that move beneath the surface of ordinary reality, knowledge of how to work with energies that most people can't even perceive. Adelaide has the heart for this work, but does she have the courage to go deeper, to learn the sacred mysteries that transform good intentions into genuine power? As if summoned by their conversation, Adelaide rose from her work with Maria and walked toward them, her step more confident than it had been even a week ago. The constant weight of grief that had bowed her shoulders and darkened her features was lifting, replaced by something that looked remarkably like purpose. She'd begun braiding her hair in the practical style favored by the sanctuary women, and her clothes had taken on the earth-toned, handmade quality of garments chosen for function rather than fashion. "Maria is ready for the dream ceremony," Adelaide said without preamble, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd learned to trust her own perceptions. "She's been here long enough to feel safe, but not so long that she's built new walls around her pain. Tonight would be the right time, when the moon is dark and the boundary between worlds grows thin." Esno studied her carefully, noting how she'd instinctively grasped timing principles that some apprentice healers took months to understand. "You sound very certain of that assessment. What makes you so sure she's ready for work that could shatter her completely if attempted too early?" "Because I recognize the signs," Adelaide replied without hesitation. "The way she's stopped flinching when people move too quickly around her. How she's begun asking questions about other people's stories instead of staying locked inside her own pain. The fact that she ate a full meal last night without having to force herself to swallow. She's ready to face her ghosts, and more importantly, she's strong enough to survive what they have to tell her." The dream ceremony was among the most powerful healing rituals in Esno's arsenal, a complex working that used sacred plants and guided meditation to allow grieving souls to communicate directly with their lost loved ones. It was also dangerous, capable of driving unstable minds completely over the edge if attempted before proper preparation had been completed. The fact that Adelaide had recognized Maria's readiness without formal training spoke to an intuitive understanding of the healing arts that couldn't be taught, only awakened. "If you believe she's ready," Esno said slowly, "then you should be the one to guide her through the ceremony. I'll prepare the sacred medicines and create the protective circle, but the actual healing work should come from someone who's walked the same path, who understands from personal experience what she encountered in the dream realm." Adelaide felt her breath catch in her throat. 3 weeks ago, she'd been prepared to end her own life rather than face another day of carrying unbearable loss. Now Esno was suggesting she take responsibility for guiding another wounded soul through the most crucial healing ritual in the sanctuary's tradition. "I don't know enough," she protested. "I've never guided anyone through a dream ceremony. What if I make a mistake? What if I lead her deeper into darkness instead of toward the light?" "Healing isn't about knowing enough," Esno replied, his dark eyes reflecting the wisdom of someone who'd learned to trust in forces larger than individual understanding. "It's about becoming a clear channel through which ancient wisdom can flow. You don't heal Maria by knowing the right words or following the proper procedures. You heal her by allowing the spirits of compassion to work through you, by becoming a bridge between her pain and the love that waits beyond it. As evening approached, Adelaide found herself preparing for responsibilities she'd never imagined. Taking on. Under Esno's careful guidance, she gathered the sacred plants needed for the dream medicine, moonflower petals that grew only in places where the earth's energy concentrated into visible light, bark from trees that had been struck by lightning and survived, roots from plants that bloomed in graveyards where grief had been transformed into peace. Each ingredient carried its own power, its own connection to the mysteries that governed the passage between life and death. The medicine doesn't do the healing, Esno explained as they worked together, grinding herbs in the ancient stone. Mortar his grandmother had used for similar ceremonies 70 years earlier. The medicine simply opens doors that fear and grief have sealed shut. What happens when those doors open depends entirely on the skill and compassion of the guide, on their ability to help the dreamer navigate experiences that can be either revelatory or devastating. The ceremony began at midnight in a small grove behind the healing lodge, where 7 ancient oaks formed a natural circle around, a spring that bubbled up from underground sources fed by snowmelt from the highest peaks. Adelaide had helped prepare similar spaces before, but this was the first time. She would be responsible for maintaining the sacred energy that protected both participant and guide from the dangers inherent in such deep spiritual work. Maria lay on a bed of soft furs in the circle's center, her face peaceful despite the magnitude of what she was about to undertake. She'd spent the day in preparation, fasting, meditation, sharing her complete story with Adelaide so that nothing would remain hidden when the dream medicine opened her consciousness to realms where secrets became impossible to maintain. Adelaide knelt beside her, one hand resting lightly on Maria's forehead, the other holding the cup that contained liquid starlight and distilled courage. "Remember," Adelaide said softly, "you're not trying to bring them back or change what happened. You're seeking understanding, forgiveness, and most importantly, permission to continue living fully despite their absence. They love you too much to want you trapped in a tomb of grief and guilt. Let them show you how to honor their memory by embracing life rather than rejecting it." Maria drank the medicine without hesitation, trusting in Adelaide's guidance the way Adelaide had learned to trust in Esno's wisdom. Within minutes, her breathing deepened and her features relaxed into the profound stillness that marked the beginning of dream work. Adelaide felt her own consciousness shifting, becoming more receptive to the subtle energies that surrounded them. The presence of spirits drawn by the ceremony's call for healing and reconciliation. What followed was unlike anything Adelaide had experienced, even during her own vision quest 3 weeks earlier. Through some mechanism she didn't understand, but had learned to trust, she found herself able to perceive Maria's dream experience as if watching it unfold on a screen visible only to her inner sight. She saw Maria reunited with her children, 6 bright souls who surrounded their mother with love and understanding that transcended the physical realm's limitations. Mama, the eldest, a boy of perhaps 12, spoke with wisdom that belonged to ages rather than years. "You think you failed us because you lived and we died. But life and death aren't competitions where someone wins and someone loses. They're just different states of being, different ways of experiencing the love that connects us all. You were meant to survive because your work in the world isn't finished yet." Adelaide found herself able to speak into the dream, her voice carrying across the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness. "What work?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if the question came from her own curiosity or from Maria's need to understand her purpose. What is she meant to do with the life you've blessed her to keep? The children's spirits turned to Spurred Adelaide with expressions of profound gratitude, recognizing her as the bridge that allowed this communication to take place. "She's meant to become a teacher," the youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 when cholera claimed her, said with the simple clarity that only children possess. Not a teacher of books and letters like you were, but a teacher of how to love again after love has been broken. There are so many mothers like her, so many women who think their purpose died with their children. She can show them how to transform grief into gifts, how to honor the dead by serving the living. The dream ceremony continued through the darkest hours of night, with Adelaide serving as both witness and guide as Maria's consciousness explored realms where healing became possible through direct contact with the sources of love that death could not diminish. By dawn, when the medicine's effects began to fade and Maria's awareness returned to ordinary reality, both women had been fundamentally changed by the experience. "I saw them," Maria whispered, her face radiant with the kind of peace that comes only after the deepest wounds have been cleansed and blessed. "My babies, my husband, all of them together and more beautiful than they ever were in life. They don't want me to join them yet. They want me to live, to help other mothers who've lost children, to show them that love doesn't end just because bodies stop breathing." Adelaide helped Maria sit up slowly, supporting her as the dream medicine's effects gradually subsided. "How do you feel?" she asked, though the answer was already visible in Maria's transformed expression. "Are you ready to begin the work they've called you to do?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything," Maria replied, her voice strong, with newfound purpose. "But I'll need training, guidance, someone to teach me how to carry this vision into the world beyond this sanctuary." She looked directly into Adelaide's eyes. "Will you be my teacher? Will you show me how to become a healer of broken hearts?" Adelaide felt the last pieces of her own transformation clicking into place with the satisfying precision of a puzzle. Finally completed. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a woman without purpose, convinced that her capacity for love had been a curse that brought death to everyone she cared about. Now she understood that her losses had been preparation, that the depth of her own grief had carved out space in her soul for a different kind of love, the kind that could reach across the boundaries between life and death to bring healing to wounds that seemed beyond remedy. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "I'll teach you everything I've learned and everything I'm still learning. Together we'll become bridges between the broken and the healed, between those who grieve and those who found peace on the other side of sorrow." As the sun rose over the sanctuary valley, painting the ancient trees in shades of gold and green that spoke of endless renewal, Adelaide Fletcher understood that her true life's work was just beginning. 1 year later, October 1874. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like blessed spirits reluctant to leave the sacred ground where so many souls had found healing. Adelaide stood at the edge of the settlement that had grown around Esno's original sanctuary, watching as the latest group of pilgrims made their way down the trail now known as the Pathway of Broken Hearts Made Whole. What had begun as a hidden refuge had transformed into something unprecedented, a chartered healing community where people of all backgrounds came to transform pain into medicine for others. Signora Adelaide. Maria Santos approached with quick steps, her face bright with enthusiasm that had replaced the devastating grief Adelaide first encountered. "The new families have arrived. 12 people this time, including 3 children who lost their parents in the Sacramento fire. They're the youngest survivors we've ever received." Adelaide felt the familiar mixture of sorrow and determination that came with each new group of refugees from life's cruelties. Over the past year, they'd welcomed more than 60 people seeking healing: war veterans, bereaved mothers, families displaced by violence. Some stayed weeks, others months, and precious few remained permanently, becoming part of the teaching community that extended the sanctuary's work into the broader world. The settlement bustled with activity that seemed impossible during Adelaide's first desperate night. Native Americans and white settlers worked side by side in communal gardens, their children playing together in languages that blended into a dialect unique to this place. Former soldiers taught survival skills to urban refugees, while tribal elders shared plant medicine knowledge with university-trained doctors seeking ancient wisdom. Adelaide. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore emerged from the medical clinic, sleeves rolled up from a morning of saving lives. The former Philadelphia physician had arrived 3 months earlier, his career destroyed by opium addiction that began when he'd started medicating grief over losing his wife and daughters to scarlet fever. Mrs. Patterson is asking specifically for you. The new treatments you suggested have made remarkable improvement possible. Eleanor Patterson represented one of Adelaide's most challenging cases, a 70-year-old woman who'd outlived 4 children, 2 husbands, and countless grandchildren. Traditional grief counseling had failed to reach her, but Adelaide's approach, combining practical work with spiritual exploration, had begun cracking the shell of despair surrounding her heart. As they approached the schoolhouse, Adelaide could hear children's voices in recitation. Through open windows came the rhythm of students learning to read using texts that acknowledged pain while teaching hope, stories that validated experiences while pointing toward transformation. The mountain stands tall, not because it has never been broken, the children chanted, but because it has learned to grow stronger where the earth cracked open. Say it with me. I am like the mountain. My breaking has made space for new strength to grow. Adelaide paused, watching her teaching methods create something unprecedented. A classroom where academic instruction and emotional healing occurred simultaneously. The approach had attracted educators throughout the territory, some visiting specifically to observe how intellectual development could integrate with psychological healing. Senora Adelaide, a young woman approached hesitantly, hollow eyes and protective posture identifying her as someone raw from recent loss. I am Carmen Delgado. They told me you might understand about losing a husband to violence, about carrying guilt when you survive, and someone you love does not. Adelaide recognized in Carmen's face the same desperate hope she'd once carried. To Thomas and Lucy's graves. I understand more than I wish I did, she replied gently, taking Carmen's trembling hand. Would you like to walk while I tend errands? Sometimes healing begins simply with having someone listen without judgment. As they walked through this settlement, Adelaide reflected on the extraordinary transformation that had occurred not just in her life, but in what frontier communities could become. Traditional Western expansion involved conquering wilderness and subduing peoples. This community represented synthesis, honoring both indigenous wisdom and settler innovation, creating something authentically belonging to the American West. I had 3 little ones, Carmen began, voice barely a whisper. Miguel was 5, Isabella 3, baby Rosa just learning to walk. My husband Eduardo worked the silver mines, sending wages home to our little house outside Virginia City. Her pace slowed as grief-telling took hold. Raiders came at night, wearing Confederate uniforms but speaking like outlaws. They wanted information about mine payrolls, which families had hidden money. Adelaide listened with patient attention, learned from Esno, allowing Carmen's story to unfold while guiding their walk past examples of hope made manifest. Gardens where food grew from soil watered by tears. Workshops where broken objects became beautiful through repair. Children playing with joy despite carrying devastating losses. Eduardo tried to protect us, Carmen continued, voice growing stronger in Adelaide's accepting presence. He told them we had nothing, barely earned enough to feed our family. But they killed him first. Then the children, when their crying annoyed them. They left me alive to remember, to carry the message that resistance would always end in blood. By the time Carmen finished, they had walked the settlement's perimeter, past every building and garden, demonstrating how creativity could transform suffering into service. Adelaide had learned not to offer quick comfort, but to create space for people to experience pain fully before beginning transformation work. Carmen, she said finally, you've survived something that would break many people completely. The fact that you're here, seeking healing instead of revenge or surrender, Tells me your spirit knows something your mind hasn't figured out. This experience can become medicine for others who've survived similar violence. As if summoned by conversation, Tupelo appeared with a middle-aged man whose bearing identified him as carrying military trauma. At 15, Tupelo had grown into his role as primary greeter and counselor, possessing intuitive understanding that allowed instant connection with even the most damaged newcomers. "Adelaide," Tupelo said quietly, "this is Sergeant Robert Murphy, recently returned from Apache campaigns. He's having difficulty adjusting to civilian life after losing his whole unit last month. I thought you might introduce him to Father Miguel, who's had remarkable success with combat veterans." Adelaide nodded, recognizing the pattern repeated dozens of times. Each arrival brought opportunities for established members to practice healing through service, creating ever-expanding circles of transformation reaching far beyond the sanctuary's boundaries. Letters arrived weekly from former residents who'd returned home carrying new approaches to grief, spreading healing work like wind-carried seeds. "Sergeant Murphy," she said, extending her hand with respect to someone who'd sacrificed for country, "welcome to our community. Meet Carmen Delgado, who arrived this morning. She understands about losing people you were supposed to protect, about carrying guilt that belongs more to circumstances than personal failure." As she watched Carmen and Sergeant Murphy begin tentative conversation that often marked the beginning of mutual healing, Adelaide felt profound completion. 1 year ago, she'd been prepared to end her life rather than carry unbearable grief. Tonight, she stood at the heart of a community that had learned to transform suffering into medicine. The evening community gathering began with the Gratitude Circle, where residents shared appreciation for kindness witnessed, progress made, simple gifts of continued existence. Adelaide listened to voices in multiple languages speaking of healing and hope discovered, children smiling for the first time in months, adults learning to sleep without nightmares. "I'm grateful," she said when her turn came, "for the Modoc boy who found me in my darkest hour and had courage to offer hope when I'd forgotten it was possible. I'm grateful for the medicine man who taught me that broken souls can heal stronger than before breaking. Most of all, I'm grateful that grief transformed into purpose has allowed me to help others discover that love doesn't end with death. It simply changes form and finds new ways to serve the living." As stars emerged above the valley where so many wounded hearts had found healing, Adelaide Fletcher understood her story had become part of something larger, proof that human beings possessed infinite capacity for transformation when they chose connection over isolation, service over self-pity, love over fear. Tomorrow knew pilgrims would arrive seeking healing. Tonight, she knew that broken things could indeed be made beautiful again.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.